Today's the day you've been waiting for. So, up until now, if I asked you what's the square root of -4, we wouldn't be able to do that. If I asked you what's the square root of 4, you could do that. It's 2. And if I asked you like that, you could do that one, right? This is 2. And then take the opposite, so we could do this. But up until now, you wouldn't be able to do the square root of -4. Well, in the explanation that I just erased, it said there that mathematicians sort of invented this value. They said, we're not content with not being able to do this. We're not content saying there's no solution to that. So they came up with this value. Square root of -1 is an imaginary value called I. They invented this. They created it. And this imaginary value I is equal to the square root of -1. And if you square both sides, square both sides, square both sides, then I squared is -1. So that's the basis of everything we're going to do today. This imaginary value I is equal to the square root of -1. And if you square both sides here, I squared equals -1. If you think about that, it's kind of makes you go, now I have a number that I can square, and it ends up being a negative number. So what we're going to do, remember when we did things like square root of 50, and we broke that down? 50 is 25 times 2. Square root of 25, square root of 2. And the reason we did that is square root of 25 is 5 roots of 2. So we broke down 50 into its factors. Similarly, that's what we're going to do for this, the square root of -4. We're going to break it down into -1 and 4. Square root of -1, square root of 4. What's the square root of 4? What's the square root of -1? So now the square root of -4 is 2i. Does that make sense? At least a little bit? At least a little bit? So we're going to simplify things like, and we're going to simplify things like, and we're going to simplify things like, and we're going to simplify things like, we'll leave it at that for now. So, square root of -25a. Well, 25 is already a perfect square. So we're going to break it down into 25 times 1. Square root of 25, square root -1. What's the square root of 25? What's the square root of -1? So your answer, 5i then. Same thing here. You always want to break it down into Square root of 5, square root of -1. Can I do anything with that square root of 5? No. So I'm just going to leave that. What's the square root of -1? So we'll write it as I times the square root of 5. Does that make sense? So far, so good. Well, as much sense as can be made from an imaginary value. How about square root of 75? Negative. Well, what can I break 75 into? 25 times 3. Remember, we did that before when you look down the list and see what perfect squares go into it. So 75, 25 times 3 times -1. And if you multiply those together, you better get what you started with, right? What's the square root of 25? Oh, I should write it like this. Right? What's the square root of 25? What's the square root of 3? It doesn't come out even. And what's the square root of -1? So 5i roots of 3. Does that make sense? Anybody with questions so far? So far, so good? Well, and of course, eventually we're going to add, subtract, multiply, and divide these. So today I wanted to do the multiplying. Remember when we multiplied roots maybe last week one day? The rule for multiplying roots, outside times outside and inside times inside. Outside times outside, inside times inside. So for this one, what's outside times outside? I times I squared, right? I times I squared. And then inside times inside, 6. 2 times 3 is 6. Am I done there? Am I done there? What is I squared equal to? -1. So if you can simplify that, you should. This I squared right here then is -1 root of 6. Or if you just want to write it as a negative root of 6, that's the same thing, right? Does that make sense? Either one of those I would take, but that's not too difficult. And if you had something like 6 times I root of, let's do another root of 6. What would that be? Outside, I times I is I squared. Inside, 6 times 6 is 36. That for sure is not simplified. What's I squared equal to? -1 times square root of 36 is, what is -1 times 6? -6, I think. Make sense? Questions so far? I have one more to show you. Maybe 2 more. There is a rule You know, the please excuse my dear Aunt Sally that tells you the order that you do things in? Well, there's a certain order that you have to do roots in. But there's no please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. You just sort of have to remember it. And what I always say to remember it, you may not multiply negatives under the root. They have to be simplified first. No matter what you're doing, they need to be simplified first. So before you do anything else, simplify this, simplify this. It's not equal to the square root of 100 is 10. Watch what happens, watch what we get for our answer if you work this up. You already know how to simplify this, right? -1 times 4, square root -1, square root of 4. What is the square root of 4? What's the square root of -1? And we're multiplying that. Same thing here. 25 -1 times 25. Square root -1, square root 25. What's the square root of 25? 5. What's the square root of -1? Now multiply those together. What's 2 times 5? 10. What's I times I? I squared. What is I squared? -1. So that actually comes out to be -10 is the correct answer. You have to simplify those first. You can't just multiply -4 times -25. It doesn't work that way. You always want to simplify these first. And then once you simplify, then you can add, subtract, multiply, or divide. But you always want to simplify those first. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? Does that make sense? So if you have something like this, you want to simplify those first. Everybody always wants to multiply. -3 times -3, that'd be the square root of 9, right? But you have to simplify them first. Always simplify first. So there's not a whole lot you can do here. That's -1 times 3, square root -1 times square root of 3. Square root of 3 doesn't come out even. What's square root of -1? I. And of course, this is another one, so it's the same thing. It's -1 times 3. It's square root -1 times square root 3. What is square root of -1? Root of 3. Now that you've simplified, now you can multiply. What's I times I? I squared. And 3 times 3? 9. What's I squared? -1. Root of 9 is -1 times 3. -3. There we go. Does that make sense? Yes, ma'am.
Couldn't you just take the first two out and multiply and then make it negative?
Well, possibly, but then if you end up with this, I'm not so sure. If one was a -3 and one was a +3, then I don't know,
But
right?
it's two negatives.
So you probably could, because it'll end up being negative. Yes. Anybody with questions? Are there any questions? Does anyone have a question? Does anyone have a question? X is equal to negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Anyone with questions? So, assignments. Assignments. I have, that would be page 291. I'm doing oral exercises today because we didn't do the whole section. Hi, Lauren. So, right here, we only did part of the section today because I want you to get used to using the I, something new. And it might take you a little bit to get used to it. So I'll be right here if you have questions.